This PowerPoint, which will be used for your PowerPoint quiz on Western expansion, will explain how the United States expanded across the western frontier in the late 1800s and how this impacted both Native Americans and American settlers who became farmers. During Western expansion in the late 1800s, the natives of the Midwest included the following peoples. They generally were the Pawnees and the Lakotas. These group of Native Americans practiced hunting, gathering, fishing, trading, and raiding. During this time period, most people tend to think of the Native Americans as Native Americans. Rather, I would want you to think of them as nations. As nations, they operated just as any other nations. There were wars between these tribes, or nations, in order to try to gain control over the region. The Indians over this time period had gained horses from the Spanish, and each one of these tribes, or nations, used these horses for their own economic and political interests. Initially, they had revered the buffalo as a spiritual manifestation on the West. They used these horses in order to track these buffalo and to use them for various activities within their tribes or nations. However, they did change their practices due to the worldwide fur trade that included the French and the English. During the 1830s to the 1860s, the U.S. relationships to the Indians were generally following a certain type of model. The model included the following. The U.S. would promise land to the west of the Mississippi to the different Native American tribes. However, this would change with the discovery of gold, as was exemplified with the gold finds in California, Colorado, and Oregon. Then there was the discovery of gold in Montana. This led to the creation of numerous trails like the Bozeman Trail. In 1868, the U.S. formed a treaty with the Native Americans called the Fort Laramie Treaty. This established a new reservation system, including California, Kansas, and Nebraska. The Treaty of Grenville established a protocol to deal with the Indians through their chiefs. Generally speaking, in the past, chiefs were negotiators of the tribes, but they were not leaders in the sense of a monarch. And so the Treaty of Grenville tried to make things more efficient so that the U.S. could form treaties with the Native Americans through one leader. Like I said in the previous slide, there tended to be a model. Native Americans would be moved, gold would be found, treaties would be signed, and then gold would be found again, and Native Americans would be expected to move. A good example of this is what happened with the Transcontinental Railroad in the late 1800s. The settlers who had moved out to the west saw the Indians as a nuisance in order to gain gold in areas like the Black Hills in the Dakotas. Also, the U.S. government wanted to build a transcontinental railroad in order to create a national market system to connect east and west for trade and nation building. The railroad would establish a breaking point for water buffalo, who instinctively would not cross to find food on the other side of these railroads. General Philip Sheridan of the U.S. Cavalry pursued a policy to isolate and move the Indians off the plains so that these railroads could be completed. In fact, it got so gruesome that train tourists who were moving through the areas would kill the water buffalo from the train. They literally would just reach out outside of the train and just massacre the water buffalo. This destroyed Native Americans' lifestyles and made it extremely difficult for them to continue their traditional hunting patterns. This eventually led to a group of wars called the Sioux Wars. The Sioux Wars occurred when the U.S. Army confronted the Sioux and Lakota Indians on the northern plains. Colonel George Custer went into Little Bighorn without proper reinforcements and was slaughtered. He had actually been warned not to do this, but because he believed that his army was so much superior than Native Americans, he went deep into the Black Hills and was surrounded by the Native Americans in a trap and then slaughtered. This did provide the U.S. troops with the moral motivation to come into the area and to seek revenge, and they did so by killing many of the major Indian leaders, such as Crazy Horse. One of the other leaders of the Native Americans, Sitting Bull, escaped into Canada, but eventually he returned and he surrendered at the Little Bighorn Reservation. The Sioux Indians were eventually centralized onto this reservation. However, the reservation had extremely poor land. But this was not the worst of the situation. In the center of this reservation, gold was discovered at Little Bighorn. Once again, the U.S. tried to make a deal with the Indians, and they promised them that they would move them out to the outskirts of the reservation and just build a railroad through the middle of the reservation. Wovoka, a traditional Indian leader inside of the reservation, developed something called the ghost dance to invoke the ancestors' protection. When the Indians started to do the ghost dance, the American government became fearful this might lead to an insurrection. So the U.S. cavalry surrounded this Indian dancing group. Eventually, they fired into the crowd, killing over 100 men, women, and children. In order to deal with Native Americans, the government formed certain policies. The policies were basically centered around the idea of assimilation. The government formed the Indian Bureau. The Indian Bureau was typically run by people who were inexperienced or at the end of their careers. So that meant that most of the people who were running this didn't have much of an interest in really helping out Native Americans. The United States government also passed the Dawes Severalty Act. The Dawes Severalty Act actually had good intentions and was generally passed by humanitarians, usually Christian humanitarians. The idea was that Indians would get a single plot of land for their family instead of farming communally, the traditional Native American way. They would then learn hard work in farming, and eventually they would become like middle-class Americans and be respected. Helen Hunt Jackson, who was observing all of this, wrote a book called A Century of Dishonor, explaining how the American policy towards Indians misunderstood their communal culture. Let's go back to the Dawes Severalty Act. The Dawes Severalty Act tried to make Native Americans into a nuclear family model, just like that of most mainstreamed Americans. The problem is, Indian culture is built along communal lines, which means that by trying to do this, the Indian culture was being undermined and destroyed, and actually led to severe depression, alcoholism, and higher suicide rates for Indians. The other major group to be affected by this westward expansion was religious groups and immigrant groups. Joseph Smith, for example, formed the Mormon religion in the East, and he was driven out due to his belief in polygamy and ended up in the West. Other immigrants, like Irish, German, Russian, Bohemian, and Scandinavian immigrants, sought new land in the West. The U.S. government provided homestead grants where families could buy land for only $10 after living there for a required amount of years. The U.S. government began funding the railroads back during the Civil War time period. The main vision was to create a transcontinental railroad which would include a national market. The three big railroads at the time to do this were the Northern Pacific, Central Pacific, and Southern Pacific. Irish immigrants worked on the railroads in the East and Midwest, while Chinese immigrants worked on the railroad in California and the Southwest. During this time, there was also a general distrust in the American federal government. This was due to a number of scandals that occurred. The most famous was the Credit Mobilier scandal. The U.S. federal government provided grants to the Union Pacific to build the Transcontinental Railroad. Union Pacific leaders created the Credit Mobilier, making it look like a separate construction company when actually it was under their own control. Credit Mobilier took government money and then invested into stocks and bonds. In order to hide all of this, the Credit Mobilier would pay congressmen in stocks and bonds to stop any investigation. This meant that the Union Pacific was basically making profits off of the American people through the American government, through the grants given to them in order to build the railroad. Another problem during this time period was the conflict that would take place between immigrants as they tried to build these railroads. The Irish on the East Coast were seen as inferior by mainstream Protestants. Many Irish were classified on the same level as African Americans were, as being some type of inferior race. Example at this time period was that the mainstream of America was called WASPs, or White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, in the middle class. The Irish tried to get away from this racism by moving west in order to find jobs, and they ended up in San Francisco. But by the time that they did, the railroads had already been completed, largely by Chinese immigrants. The Irish found a leader under a man named Dennis Kearney, who blamed the Chinese. They actually started rioting against the Chinese in their communities, shooting and hanging Chinese males late at night in both Los Angeles and San Francisco. Eventually, this led to a statewide and then a national law that was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, keeping out all new Chinese immigrants. Farmers, who initially were immigrants coming out as homesteaders, began facing their own problems against the railroad. Farmers would settle on the land and eventually face what were called diminishing returns. What would happen in farming is that farmers would produce, but they would have to produce both in relationship to domestic and foreign competition. Farmers ended up blaming the Transcontinental Railroad for too high prices for freight goods. They pointed to the fact that short hauls tended to have higher prices, while long hauls tend to have cheaper prices. This seemed to go against intuitive common sense, and they wanted regulations. This did eventually lead to a number of farmer movements to try and solve the problem. These were called farmer alliances. They tried to get states to regulate railroads. Also, they would try to create local cooperatives where they could share goods with other farmers in order to keep costs down. Eventually, it led to a success with the development of the Grange movement that was able to work to get states to regulate railroads. But the Supreme Court eventually knocked this down as being unconstitutional, since railroads crossed across state lines and could only be regulated by Congress. The next movement that was formed that was successful was known as the populists. The populists argued that the government should own railroads and telegraphs, institute an income tax on the rich in order to try to break down the concentration of wealth, and create more money in the society through bimetallism, in which both gold and silver would back up money. The idea here would be to artificially inflate currency so that people would buy more farm goods. The major problem was a division within the movement between poor white farmers and poor black farmers.